Just a note before we start. Our show talks about touchy subjects that may be difficult for some of our listeners. Take care of yourself. If you feel you need to seek help, see the links at the end of our show notes for resources.
Hey y'all, and welcome to Touchy Subjects Podcast, the podcast that aims to break the silence that tends to come with conversations around domestic and sexual violence. I'm Sean.
And I'm Amanda.
And today we're going to be discussing the neurobiology of trauma with our friend Jen Fraser. So thank you for joining us today, Jen.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm super happy to be back.
Yes, we're very excited to have you back, especially because this is an episode where you just get to nerd out the entire time. And we always enjoy having our friends come on when they can just kind of be nerdy about their favorite topics. So,
well, that's definitely what you're going to get today.
Perfect. So really kind of just jumping into this, Jen, since you have joined us already, we don't need to do the whole introduction. Really just jumping in, the neurobiology of trauma, it's super interesting, at least to me, just because, like, again, I'm also nerdy, but knowing that the things that we've experienced not only are going to kind of like dictate how our brain gets wired, but that wiring then really kind of changes our outlooks on life, changes our interactions with other people. So really just jumping in then, when somebody is traumatized, what can they expect to have kind of happen to their brains?
Yeah, so I mean, just even the way you phrase the question is so perfect, because I think the first thing that we all need to understand, and it tends to be a mistake we make, when we say the word trauma, we immediately think, oh, we were on a boat and it sank, or we had to leave a war-torn country and get to safety, or our house burned down. We're all very comfortable saying, oh, I had a traumatic thing that happened to me. But here's what's fascinating when it comes to the brain. For the brain, those things aren't nearly as traumatizing as something like domestic violence. And I'll explain why. Those massive events where your brain and body are at risk, they require the brain and body to join forces like they do in a powerful way to go into fight mode, into flight mode, and into freeze mode. Now, all of us in those situations probably would have chosen flight. You run away from the burning building, you swim to save your life when you're thrown into the water from a boat that sinks, and you have to get away from a war-torn country. You become a migrant, you try to get into another country across a line to get away from the war, right? All of us relate to that. That is what human brains and bodies do, okay? So in that moment, what is happening in the brain and body? Faced with those kinds of external traumas to our survival, to our safety, we pump up adrenaline and cortisol on an unconscious level. We're not choosing to do this. Our brain and body have gone, okay, we're going to die. And so we're going to put this package together, the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to save our lives. And that's why humanity is still here on the planet today. Okay, so it's this beautiful system. It's brilliantly designed. It gets us to safety. Now, let's look at the trauma that most of us are much more likely to face, which is the trauma from being in a relationship with somebody who is traumatized. So they are already in fight mode. I mean, in domestic abuse, of course, the person, they haven't chosen, but they obviously come from traumatic background, almost guaranteed they come from traumatic background, and they haven't gotten out of fight mode. So they are perpetually predicting that they're under threat. And it's a very traumatized brain that does this. So they come usually to this type of traumatic behavior, from their past. And I'm not excusing it for 1 second. I'm not saying they don't deserve to be held accountable. I'm not saying that the people that they harm should somehow have understanding, compassion, and care. Yes, they should, I guess, but only when safety is established. Safety is the number one. Nobody has the right to hurt somebody else, bottom line. So I think that if we start to look at this as a medical crisis and as an issue of brain body that has gotten completely scrambled so that it no longer correctly identifies what is threatening its survival, we're going to be able as a society to better unpack this problem, not create villains who are monsters, who must be locked up for the rest of their lives. None of that's working. We've tried that and it does not work. So if we start to rethink the whole crisis as well, what's, just as you asked, Sean, what's going on in the brain? What's the neurobiology of this? How can we understand that in order to make better decisions around, first of all, getting into a relationship with someone who's highly traumatized, and second of all, understanding what happens in our own brain and body so that we find it very hard to walk away. So going back to this notion of trauma writ large as this massive thing, we all go, oh, that's trauma. We don't recognize that our brain and body are getting traumatized when it's death by 1,000 cuts. Mm-hmm. Now, hopefully most of your audience already knows that expression. Death by 1,000 cuts is what happens in domestic abuse, whether it's to a child or to the spouse or partner. Mm-hmm. It starts small. And as the person gains a sense of dominance or a sense of power, they start to feel more, ironically, they start to feel more threatened. The more they think that they're in control, the more they're riddled with anxiety that they will lose control. And so they have stronger and stronger behaviors that they use to somehow create the environment that makes their brain and body feel safe, because that's really all they know. They only know that by expressing and manifesting dominance, violence, coercion, control, will they be able to secure the survival situation that they need. And so it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes a vicious circle. And what's happening in the brain of the victim, the person on the receiving end of all of this fight behavior, a person pumped full of cortisol, the stress hormone, and adrenaline, which activates the cortisol, that person is so unhealthy and you're faced with them. And so you start to participate. It's like a dance. You start to participate in helping them feel safe. So you start to cower. You start to cast your eyes down. You start to behave in ways that they require more and more and more to please them so that they feel safe. You love them. You care about them. You want them to be safe. And every single time you participate in this trauma together, you start to feel the perception of inescapability in your own brain. You start to feel learned helplessness. And this is all well documented in research. So the learned helplessness is every single time you are screamed at, yelled in the face, threatened, hit, your child is hit, you get convinced on a brain body level, it's unconscious, it's not your decision. Your brain and body start to make decisions like freeze, do not move a muscle, is going to be survival. And it gets into this debate with flight. If I flee, if I run away, if I use that part of the sympathetic nervous system, he may follow me. He may pursue me. He may hurt my children. He may go after my family. He's so traumatized. The trauma is just spilling everywhere. Everyone's going to be in danger. So imagine we have these three key systems. All of them are activated in domestic abuse. We've got fight, the perpetrator who is harming. We've got flight, the individual who wants to run away. And we've got freeze, the individual who's trapped in a belief that they can't ever get away. And it's not that they're staying because they want to. It's not a conscious decision. It's a very unconscious survival strategy.
Yeah. And don't want to cut you off here, Jen, but I just want to kind of highlight for our listeners the importance of understanding that when they may have been in a situation where freeze was the thing that took over, because the way that we respond to a traumatic event, if it is a freeze moment, there's some blame that comes along with that, where we blame ourselves. Like, well, why did I freeze there? Why didn't I fight? Why didn't I run? So it can be really helpful for them to understand that, well, your brain is telling you, definitely freeze here. Do not fight. Do not run. And it might make it a little bit easier for them to kind of digest that of, well, okay, yeah, I didn't run. I didn't fight because my brain and body were actively telling me not to.
Our brain's job is to preserve ourselves, right? So whatever your brain is telling you at that moment that this is your best chance for survival, that's what it's going to tell your body to do. And your body's going to listen because it doesn't know any better at that moment. So if it's saying, if you freeze, if you don't cause any more altercation, then that's going to be your best chance. It's just what we do. And honestly, there's really nothing that we can do about it at that time. It doesn't matter how much you think about it ahead of time, or you train, or you take a self-defense class or anything like that. Nobody knows how their brain is going to respond in that moment until they're in that moment.
That's exactly right. And, I always find that people, I don't know if we talked about this last time, but I find that when you're trying to explain the model, people really understand it better if you talk about animals. So let's take the domestic abuse scenario and look at it as animals. So just to reinforce Amanda and Sean's point here, if you see a rabbit in the forest and it spots a wolf, and the wolf saw its movement and is looking for it, that predator is putting its life at risk, and it knows it. On an unconscious cellular level, it's trained through evolution to respond to that. And what does it do? It freezes. All of a sudden, the wolf can't see it anymore. It doesn't move a muscle. It doesn't blink an eye. And that's how it survives. Okay? That's the freeze response. Human beings are creatures on one level. We are, and we act like creatures. Let's look at flight. The wolf sees a deer, and the deer takes a look at it and it makes the decision. It could have frozen. It's possible for a deer to freeze, but it decides in that moment to run as fast as it can, and it outruns the wolf. The wolf's fast, but there's nothing that can catch that deer. When it sets its sight, and it can leap over things. So the deer is gone. That's the flight response, same as human beings. That's the escape. Let's look at fight, the predator. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but if we're going to use the animalistic model, it also works. We've all encountered a dog that has been beaten or abused or neglected, and we want to go over to it and pat it. And all of a sudden it starts baring its teeth, its fur stands on end, and it starts to growl. And we meet eyes with it, and then we put our eyes down because we know that it is so threatened. It doesn't know we want to pet it. It predicts that we're going to strike it, like it has been hit multiple times before. It's using the survival strategy of fight. So all of us human beings, all of us creatures are in this horrible interactive behavioral thing that I hope and dream and believe that brain science and neurobiology can help us address in healthier ways. Not that we don't make safety and protection of the victim our absolute priority. That's the absolute priority. Let's not even put that on the table. But if we could teach people and talk to people so that every single one of us is understanding, starting in childhood, wait a second, this is a response I'm having. Here's what's going on at home. This is why I act this way. Why don't we develop this vocabulary starting young?
Yeah, and I want to kind of circle back just a little bit because I liked the distinction you were making between like the short-term traumatic events, like the short-term like traumatic events, like those one-time instances of trauma versus like the long-term over days, months, years of trauma, how our bodies and brains kind of learn to mold itself to the trauma that it is experiencing to continue on to try to thrive as best it can in now this adverse environment. Or like the short-term trauma, like, okay, that was a one-time thing. Like, I'm no longer in that event. I'm no longer in that area. My body can kind of like decompress, process it, and then move forward. But someone who's experienced trauma for a long period of time may have a lot harder time trying to move forward from that point because their body has gotten so used to that trauma. Is that correct there, Jen?
Absolutely. It's, so what's so fascinating about the brain and what's empowering about the brain is when you've been exposed to something over and over and over, it has developed neural networks in your brain. I mean, the brain changes based on environment. The brain changes based on what we practice. So the really horrible fact is if you've been in an abusive relationship, you've developed a whole bunch of neural networks that are coping mechanisms for the fact that you're in a perpetual sense of destabilization, of anxiety, of kind of being torn in two directions, because the person that you're close to, the person you chose, the person you care about is betraying you on one level. And the brain really struggles to understand that. The brain can go, yeah, fire, that's a bad thing from an external place that has a real threat factor. But when you live with someone who has financial control over you, let's say, or they are so beloved by your family, they're so highly respected in the workplace and you're not, or they have control over your children. So the person usually has a power imbalance, a leverage in some case. When you're in relationship with that sort of person who's constantly telling you that you deserve what happens to you, it's your fault what happens to you, you're the one that causes the negativity, the harm, the hurt, this kind of programming, our brains are susceptible to it, especially when you get isolated. And I'm sure you guys have heard this a million times, but in the psychology they refer to it as betrayal trauma. And betrayal trauma requires us frequently, and it makes a lot of sense, to put on blinders. So, you think of a horse, you're trying to protect it in a city, you don't want it to see too much chaos and cars and so on. So you put blinders on. That's what the victim of a domestic abuse scenario does, or a child who's been abused in the home. They have to put blinders on because it's the only way that they can somehow manage the power imbalance, like a dependency they have on the person that hurts them, and the fact that they are being hurt. It's just, the brain can't simultaneously have the two things happening at once. So yeah, the death by 1,000 cuts, the repeated behaviors that start small and then build and build and build to the point where you really your life might even be at risk. That is really serious trauma for the brain, even though it starts small, way more serious than the fire, the immigration, and the sinking boat.
To take that back to like the animal idea, right? It's the same thing that is happening. Like, people have probably heard this, but like if you put a frog in a pot of water that's hot, it's going to jump out. If you put it in a pot of water and then turn the burner on and it gradually starts to heat up, by the time that frog realizes its danger, it can't jump out anymore. So it's like a very slow kind of, you get used to it over that little bit of time until it's to a point of no return.
So that's totally brilliant. I love that analogy. It's the opening sentence to my book, The Bullied Brain, is exactly that. It's about how our brain, I say our brain can normalize almost anything. And the key word in the sentence, and I chose it very, very purposefully, the key word is almost. So I was in a situation in a school where they were normalizing highly abusive behavior by teachers. There were 4 teachers, not the vast majority of teachers were fabulous. 4 of them were highly abusive. And we were expected to normalize the behavior. There was tons of pressure on everybody to act like it was fine, that it wasn't doing any harm. It was this, it was that. There was all kinds of excuses. You're calling it abuse. Really, it's motivation. It's like, really? It was just the most unbelievable mind game. And it's the mind game that the domestic abuse survivor goes through. So Amanda, that's one of my favorite analogies. I love it. It makes perfect sense. And it's so true. Anyone who's been through it knows it. But the truth of it is too, even the frog that's swimming around in the warm water, which is what happened to me, where I was like, whoa, I guess it's me. I'm sure the problem lies with me. I'm so hysterical. I'm too sensitive. Why do I think these kids need to be protected from this type of behavior when everyone else says it's fine? I still jumped.
And almost taking this one step further, looking at once the environment becomes normalized, you become used to the environment, how the neurological pathways in your brain have now been built where you just kind of like rationalize and accept this is the environment and you continue on with it. An example I like to use a lot, and it was from one of my professors when I was in my master's program, and I use it all the time in my human trafficking trainings to help people kind of understand how our biases and stereotypes come from. And how many of you like drive somewhere and you've driven that path hundreds of times. So your brain no longer codes for that information because you don't remember the drive anymore. You've built the pathway and you just jump on cognitive cruise control. So once you're on that cognitive cruise control, you're not going to code for new information because you don't need to. And unless something drastically different than normal happens, it's just how you're going to follow it. So that's where bias and stereotypes come from. I've learned how to interact with certain people based on preconceived notions. So that's how I'm going to interact with them, because I want to get in and out of this encounter as fast as possible. When someone's experienced trauma for a long period of time, they've built their neurological pathways, they've built that cruise control. So the next time, let's say they're in a new relationship and their partner yells at them, and that's a bit too much like their previous partner who was abusive towards them, their brain jumps onto that path. They know what pathway they need to follow and take in order to get out of this situation as quickly as possible and as safe as possible. So that's what happens.
Yeah, that's an equally, it's an amazing thing, because when the brain is learning how to drive, so if we just extend your analogy, remember when you're learning how to drive and you're 16, your entire brain is laser focused on an incredibly challenging task. That incredibly challenging task is you have to remember tons of rules. You have to watch out for everybody's safety. There's dogs, there's kids, there's a cyclist, a skateboarder. You need to know all these different signals, and they're happening in the moment. Like, our brains have the capacity to learn something massively complicated like driving. And then what's so amazing is, just as you said, we get so good at it. Our brains are so smart that we go, yeah, we don't need all the resources every time we drive. We drive every day, and we've done it for 20 years. So that's autopilot. I need my brain to remember what I have to buy at the supermarket. I got to pick my kid up from practice. I need to get home, and home is really like a stress. And I've got all these work deadlines. You know, our brain, while we're driving, is holding onto this whole other world that we have to be responsible for, and that is requiring problem solving, creative thinking, you name it. So, I mean, it's such an interesting thing, and it should be empowering for people, even though it's really hard to break with what you've become used to. If you are the frog who's being treated so poorly that you're caught, if you are on autopilot because that's the only way you've been able to survive, what I want people to really hear today is, if you think neural networks, those are the highways in your brain. You've driven them so many times, you go so fast, the electrical coding, everything is just lightning. And it's easy. It's so easy for the three of us today to say to you, you know what? You have the capacity to change. It actually requires you to pull out a machete and start cutting a new neural network, a new pathway, a new road for yourself, which is really, really hard. It's not the default. It's not what you've always done. It's the hardest thing in the world, and you can do it. You have every single thing you need in your brain and body to carve that new path. And as Sean says, to be hyper alert to, you know what? Yelling in my face, sorry, I don't do that. That's not my new neural path. Says no. I walk away when that happens, and I won't tolerate it. You become literally a new person. Why? Because you can change your brain. We all have neuroplasticity till the last day we're on the planet. We can change our brains to be a completely new individual.
I love that. I love like the hope that that statement can give to people, because especially people who are like, this is just how I live my life, and it is what it is, which is something that we hear a lot. To know that biologically you can change that neural pathway, and you can. It's going to take work. It's not going to be easy. It took a long time probably for you to get to that point where that was your normal. So it's going to take even longer to get you to the point where there is a different normal. But it's possible, and you don't need some far-fetched thing to make it happen. You don't need someone to give you surgery. You don't need you. It's work that you can do yourself with a therapist or a counselor or a support group, and you can make that change when you're ready to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And really kind of moving on with like that hope messaging for our listeners, because I do want to talk about trauma and those who abuse, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So for those who have experienced abuse and experienced trauma, as most of us have, because you don't make it out of life without probably experiencing some form of trauma, how can we start to work on rebuilding those neurological pathways to be pathways that we want to have?
Yeah, no, I mean, so it's a key question. So when I was working on my book, I wanted to, so imagine me, I'm researching for the bullied brain. And every single day, I'm shocked. I'm like, how come people don't know this? How come nobody taught me? How come we don't mention the brain? Why don't we know that all forms of bullying and abuse actually neurologically change our brains physically? It can be seen on a brain scan. It does damage. And I'm not just talking hitting people, I'm talking all the way down to put downs, emotional neglect, acting like you don't exist, ignoring you when you speak. Like these things are terrible for the brain. They leave physical damage on the brain, neurological scars, and nobody talks about it. So I was in this mode of like, this is the worst thing I've ever read in my life. And then I hit the neuroscience, which is just as extensive, just as replicated, just as peer reviewed. I hit the neuroscience, 20 years on what can we do about it. And so I built into the book with every single chapter, these are the steps we need to do to get out of the trauma zone that we're in and establish health and well-being for our brains. And as Amanda said, it's hard work. It's not, you don't blink your eyes and it happens. You have to be as steely comportment dedicated as a marathon runner. You have to choose it every single day. You don't have to be perfect every day. The brain learns by making mistakes. So you're going to make mistakes. You're going to fall back into old patterns and you're going to dust yourself off and get back up again. But you have to fight for it. And I would argue it's like getting physically fit when you haven't been working out. It's painful. Like going for a jog when you haven't been working out is like one of the worst things we could do. You feel horrible. You look awkward. It's like there's no joy in it. Cut to 6 months. If you've gone running every single day and you started at 5 minutes and you've built up to 15, 20, at 6 months, you're just like, can't do that now. Don't want to miss my run. And you've become a totally different person. It's the same thing with brain health. So I built in every single chapter. And, just to give people a quick sense, and I promise you, every single thing I say is backed by extensive neuroscience research. The things that we can do to regain our fight and our strength and our refusal to be maltreated, and our healthy brains that are about survival, are things like aerobic exercise. Like it's incredible what aerobic exercise does for the brain. It's just unbelievable. Mindfulness. Now, it's an ancient practice. Exercise has been around forever. Same thing with mindfulness. And in Asian cultures, it's 2,000 years old. Well, the neuroscientists got a hold of it and they're like, unbelievable what mindfulness does for the brain. It's so good for you. And then I do a lot of exercises that I design myself because I'm trying to help people that are actually traumatized. Things like talking to your brain. You say to your brain, you know what? We're safe. We're safe right now. You're ramping up. I can feel it. My heart rate's going. My blood pressure's going through the roof. I'm shallow breathing. I'm having a panic attack, but I'm sitting in a room by myself, or I'm in a library. Like I'm not in danger. I need to tell my brain to take it down. And I'm start to get conscious of my sympathetic stress response. And I can turn that stress response because I've gotten really keyed into what my brain is doing and needs. I can turn that into what's called a parasympathetic response, which is the neuroscientists call it rest and digest. And rest and digest is when the brain knows it's safe and it calms the heart rate down, the blood pressure down, the breathing starts to be deep from the belly, and the cortisol and adrenaline drop. You do not want cortisol coursing through your system. It's extremely hard on your mental health and extremely hard on your physical health. So, we don't have time chatting today, but there are evidence-based, inexpensive, all of us can do them every single day practices. I built them into the bullied brain. That's why the subtitle is Heal Your Scars and Restore Your Health, because all of us can do it.
I enjoy listening to things that always revolve around like, what steps can people take? How can they do some of these things? Because my brain always goes to public health stuff. Sorry, Amanda. Because like the stages of change model is like the exact thing that you're kind of talking about, is like, if you want to make those changes, like there are steps you can take to do that. So like you're either in pre-contemplation where you're not even thinking about changes, contemplation where you're now thinking about it, preparation where you're like taking the steps to begin to do the thing, then you're like your action and your maintenance phases. But it's important, and you pointed it out too, Jen, to remember that you're going to make mistakes. You're going to fall off. And when you fall off, that doesn't necessarily mean you got to start back at zero. Using myself as the example, because I'm notoriously bad at continually working out for very long periods of time. I know I need to work out. I've done all the prep work. I've got the gym membership. I've got the workout clothes. I know when I can go. It's just getting there. And then once I get there and I'll go consistently for a couple months, eventually I'll fall off again. I don't jump right back to pre-contemplation. I know I need to work out still. I have a desire to do it. So I just jump back into the either contemplation or action, where I have to preparation or action. And that cycle continues. And you're never going to arrive. Like, you're going to need to continually maintain. So when you can get to a point where you're like, I feel like I'm pretty good, that doesn't mean you're done. It just means that you can now work on maintaining that point and devoting some more brain power to other things.
And that can be disheartening to people because, like, we all want an end goal, right? We want to say, at this point, this is when I have made it. But you're not ever going to get to that made it point because you continually have to keep maintaining. But the thing about it is, maintaining is so much easier than all that work you have to do to get there. So while it can seem really daunting in the beginning, like, what, I'm never going to just be a physically fit person and just be able to call it good. I'm never going to be able to be a mentally fit person and just call it good. I don't want to have to keep doing all this work for my entire life. It's not as much work for your entire life. It's a manageable level, and it's something that will just become ingrained in you, and you just continue to make a daily choice where you say, these are the things that I just do now to be fit. If you are talking about working out and you're like, okay, well, even if I'm not going to do a strenuous workout today, I'm going to go for a walk or I'm going to do some stretches. If you're, talking about mentally fit and you're like, okay, I'm not going to go to therapy today, or I'm not going to go to my group session, but I'm going to do some self-meditation. I'm just going to talk to my brain. It doesn't have to continuously be that hardcore workout. Once we get to a point where we're like, okay, this feels good, we can just maintain it.
Yeah, I love that. That's kind of I love that inner dialogue and the self-compassion. It's like, I need to know what I can do today. And every single day, whatever form it takes, a gentle form, or I'm going to really push myself form, every single day I'm moving forward. And it's a mindset. One of the things I found really fascinating in the research, and I think it's something all of us can employ to help us, is they've learned that people who do commit to making the change and doing the hard work, they call it deliberate practice. So deliberate practice can be learning to be a violin player, learning to become physically fit, learning to, solve math problems at work, whatever it is that you've chosen. So let's use our domestic abuse victim. They're going to choose, and they're going to put in the deliberate practice. They know it's going to be the hardest thing they've arguably done in their life, but they're going to do it. They've made that decision. So using your public health language, Sean, they've switched. They've clicked that switch, and they're beyond preparation. They're actually doing it, which is scary, and it's making the brain feel really panicky, but they're still doing it. The key thing they find in people who actually succeed at this is they have a role model. If you don't believe, you have to believe on the brain level that you can do it. If you don't believe you can do it, you're never going to put in the deliberate practice. So trying to make it all about your own small self, that's really hard. You choose a role model that you go, I am her, I am him. They were in my situation and they got out and they became an advocate, and they are so powerful and so safe. And that's what I'm aiming for. And you have that role model. You look at it every single, her, him, whatever. You look at it every single day and you go, that's who I want to be. That's who I am going to be. and I have to put in deliberate practice to get there. You don't just leap to that. You have to put in the work. But your brain is way more likely to put in the work if you can visualize, see, and imagine that this person who was once in your shoes, he or she isn't anymore.
And I love it because I get to use public health knowledge because it's why I just like when you're in public health, they'll often tell you like figure out what model you want to use before you create your like programming or whatever. But I would argue you always need to use every different model of behavior change, because the theory of planned behavior takes into account that modeling, takes into account the use of other people, and taking into account what does my community believe around whatever action I want to take as other reinforcing the positive behavior I want to do, or disincentivizing the negative behavior that I don't want to do anymore. So if we can build ourselves up to a point where like, this is what I want to do, we can find those people in our community who share those same beliefs as us and would be the ones who would help us reinforce the behavior change we want to see. It makes it easier, because it's easier for us to say like, they can do it, I can do it too. Or they've already outlined all the steps I need to take to get to where they got to. I can follow some of those things and reduce some of the barriers that I might have to wanting to continue on or staying in that action or maintenance phase.
Right, because we don't all have the capability, the time, the knowledge to figure all those things out on our own. So we have to rely on people who have been there before, done it before, or studied it, or wrote wonderful books about it. That's why we go to those therapy sessions and we rely on the expertise of our therapist or our counselor to help lead us through those steps, because we don't all have the capacity to just figure those out on our own. You know, you're either going to do research about what it is you need to do, or you're going to listen to somebody who's been there and done it before.
Yeah, what I think is so interesting in what you guys have said there, and like what's such an important message, is sometimes, frequently, when we are in these situations, we're surrounded by a group or a culture or a community that tells us, that helps us normalize the behavior and makes us believe that what's happening is reasonable and so on. I mean, that's the situation I was in. As I talked about, the culture around me, which was a very closed culture, a very wealthy, prestigious, 100-year-old private school, and everybody was sort of united in saying, we need to stick together, circle the wagons, don't point fingers, don't suggest there's anything wrong here. Everything's fine. Everything's normal. And it's really hard to think clearly in those situations and stick to your own sense of what's right and wrong. And, we see this all the time. I do a lot of work, not so much in the personal, but in the organizational. So we call this institutional complicity, where the institution is telling you that you're the problem. The fact that you're speaking up is highly problematic, and you're going to be penalized for doing it. This is what happens to whistleblowers all the time. You come marching out and you're like, whoa, I noticed that there's all this fraud and corruption happening, or even worse, I noticed that there's serious abuses occurring. And all of a sudden you find yourself being the villain of the story. And you're like, wait a second, how did we go 180 degrees? I was the person pointing out there's something wrong and it's really serious. And all of a sudden everybody's telling me that it's my fault, I'm wrong, I'm hurting people by speaking up. So what I love about this idea of choosing the role model is it can almost be your own private, conscious, secret thing. It's like someone separate from your community, you're looking at them and how they escaped a certain mindset or way of thinking or normalizing of particular behaviors, and they walked. And you want to, like something that you said, Sean, made me think of this. It's almost like reverse engineering. You look at the steps they took. How did they get there? And then break it down. Here's my plan. I don't feel like like the normalizing isn't working for me anymore. I've taken the blinders off. I see this for what it is, and it's not good for me. And that's okay. I'm an individual. I'm unique. I can choose my own path. I have every right to, and I'm going to walk. and you use your role model outside of your immediate community or your organization or your institution to do it.
And when we're talking about, like, say, a domestic violence survivor, that institution is their relationship. So once they've even thought about trying to stand up and say, this isn't right, this isn't how I can keep doing things, then they're the one that's wrong. They're the one that's causing problems. And, we see this all the time in our survivors, is that they've been made to feel like they're the one who's done something wrong to cause this situation.
Yeah, it's so, that reversal is exactly how gaslighting works. As you guys are experts in this, you would know. Gaslighting works by reversal. So you say, I am not going to stay in the institution of marriage, let's call it. I'm not going to stay in the institution of marriage or relationship anymore because you hurt me. And the person goes, you hurt me. And you're like, okay, what just happened here? Now, this happens on the political level just as much as it happens on the individual level. In other words, the reason I say this is our brains are highly susceptible to this type of manipulation. They're vulnerable to it. Our brain can't hold two things simultaneously very well. It can't say, I am the betrayer, I am the betrayed. Michael Merzenich, the neuroscientist who I work closely with, he describes that brilliantly as, this is when the brain can't answer the question. If the brain can't answer the question, am I the betrayer or am I the betrayed? All systems degrade in the brain. That is a traumatic shock for the brain. When it can't answer the question and establish what's reality, it starts to degrade all systems like a concussed victim. So think of it this way. Lungs are meant to breathe in and out air. That's what they do. That's their job. The heart is meant to pump the blood. That's its job. That's what it does, designed by evolution for this. The brain's job is to make sense of reality. When the brain can't make sense of reality, it starts to self-destruct, just like when the lungs don't get air and the heart can't pump the blood properly. It's an organic thing, and it's designed to make sense of reality. When it can't answer the question, it starts to degrade all systems. And this is why people make terrible decisions when they're in these horrible relationships where they're being gaslit.
And another big dichotomy there that the brain is going to be going through in this is, this person is supposed to be the person who loves me. This person is the person who also abuses me. And whether you're talking about adults in a relationship, you're talking about children with a parent or a caregiver, that brain is now trying to figure out, how is this person who is supposed to love and care for me also the same person who causes me this harm? And like you said, it can't hold on to both of those things at once. So when it's the person who's causing you harm, you think about it in one way, but then that doesn't happen continuously, and all of a sudden that person is the person who loves you and cares for you again. That's the only piece of it we can hold on to. We're not going to keep remembering all of those bad things that happened because our brain can't comprehend both of them happening at the same time.
That is it. That is exactly it. So let's go back to full circle.
Good at this.
You're so good at it. Let's go back full circle to where we started. The brain can understand that the fire is dangerous. That's pretty easy. It understands that the sinking boat is really dangerous. That's pretty easy. And it goes, war. War is going to kill me. That's pretty easy. Where the brain shuts down is exactly how Amanda articulated it. It cannot hold the two things simultaneously. It doesn't hold love and hate in the same way. It makes no sense to the brain. So the brain starts to like self-destruct. It can't cope. And that's real trauma. And that's why when they do, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, you'll notice, this is something I always try to talk to people about, every single question they ask is not about external trauma. They're not looking, they weren't studying, those doctors were not studying war, fire, cyclones, sinking boats. They weren't looking at any of that. All of the questions are on person in a caregiver role who's hurting you. And again, like, we don't have to blame and shame. Sometimes people hurt you because they have mental illness. Sometimes they hurt you because they have an addiction problem, blah, blah, blah. Bottom line is, all of the questions they ask are about adults in positions who hurt children, consciously or unconsciously, because that is serious trauma. That's what leads to chronic illness in midlife, not the fire and the immigration and the boat.
And this really brings up a part for me, at least, is that we can say, like, a survivor, you absolutely never have to forgive the person who harmed you. You never have to reach out to them or have any communication with them whatsoever, because they have done you harm. But if we're looking at this from a societal standpoint, where we don't want to have abusive people exist in the first place, understanding where the abuse is coming from, because yes, it is a cognitive choice that they are making in that moment to be abusive. Their brain has led them to that choice. And again, as a survivor, you don't have to forgive them. But as a society, if we want these abuses to stop, we have to understand what led them to those points so we can address them, help them rewire their brains so that way they're not abusive anymore.
I'm so glad you said that, because it goes back to when we were talking about physical fitness and how we feel. If people use the analogy that the brain is a lot like a muscle, which in fact it is, you can make your brain stronger every single day, and you can make it more flexible every single day, just like a muscle. And we rehabilitate torn ACLs, we rehabilitate shoulders, we rehabilitate everything except for the brain. When we've got a brain that's manifesting extremely aggressive fight behaviors, we act as if it's a moral failure and the person should be locked up in a medieval prison. It's like, really? In the bottom of the castle? Like, come on, it's the 21st century. We know so much about brains. Sometimes you can't rehabilitate them. Mm-hmm. That's just a tragic reality, but many of them can be utterly rehabilitated. And especially if you catch them young. If you have somebody who has manifested this behavior at 21 or in high school because they come from abusive backgrounds and fight has been the only way they've survived, if you catch them at that stage of brain development and you implement a plan to rehabilitate them, just like you would with a broken bone or torn ACL, you can absolutely rehabilitate that brain and train it to be safe, train it to be compassionate, train it to not default to lashing out behaviors, because it doesn't need to. I mean, all of us can way better manage our sympathetic nervous system.
And that doesn't ever negate the harm that they've caused up to that point. It doesn't make it all better or fix the things that that victim is now having to deal with. But you have to make a societal choice. Mm-hmm. Are we going to try and help this person be the kind of person that our society views as good? So somebody who is compassionate, someone who is caring or loving or can hold a relationship without being abusive. Are we going to try and help them get back to that point? Or are we just going to discard them and say, no, I'm done with you? And I know, like you said, there's not everybody can be rehabilitated. There are some crimes that we just can't ignore in that sense. But as a humanity, as a society, like, where are we going to try and put that effort? And I know where I would like that effort put. I know where a lot of people that are in my social circles would like that effort put, but we have to decide that as a whole.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, the thing is, if we put our focus upstream, if we made our focus about prevention, if we actually were a society that really did a fabulous job on education and intervention on child abuse, we wouldn't have highly abusive adults. It's just a fact. And so, I mean, I also understand very deeply, because I've been hurt and traumatized myself. I understand the desire to have retribution, to make them pay, to seek revenge. That's a very human feeling, and it's deep in our cells, and I totally get it. But societally, humanity-wise, We need to start with upstream intervention and education. I think we talked about the last time, the fact that our society still spends so much time on the fantasy wedding and like the rom-coms and programs young women in particular to believe that this is the ideal. And then at the same time, we program young men with toxic masculinity at the hands of older males to believe that the misogynistic, homophobic, like really sick and twisted stuff is the way to manifest their virility and their strength in a male culture. I mean, it's like a train wreck. It's the two things hitting each other, and it's what our culture does. And then we're really surprised that we've got a domestic abuse problem. It's like, let's take a look at how we train young people, you know?
Yeah.
It just drives me crazy. If I was teaching everybody, I'd make them all learn the brain science.
Yeah. I love just giving those examples in presentations all the time. Like if we're teaching young boys to solve problems through violence, that you can't talk about your emotions or any of your issues, or that makes you feminine in any way, but then also teaching them that being feminine is bad or less than, if they're straight or bisexual, end up in a relationship of somebody with a woman, like, why is it surprising that we have men committing the most violence when we've taught them that violence is the correct way to solve issues?
Yeah. And you know what? I love that too, because it goes back to the hypocrisy. It goes back to how brains are so scrambled. They can't hold the two things together. It's like we tell children, we have zero tolerance for bullying children, except if you're an adult. And then we actually will give you power and prestige if you bully people. How is the brain supposed to understand that and not be just a mess?
Yeah. Or we tell them bullying is bad. Unless you like the person, then go ahead and pull their hair or pinch them or tease them.
It's just, I know. Oh my goodness.
So Jen, thank you for joining us today. I know we are about at the hour mark and I want to be very cognizant of your time, but before we sign out here, is there anything else you would like to let our audience know or point out before we sign off?
I think the phrase that really just summarizes our entire conversation, all of the dialogue we've had, is hurt brains hurt. Hurt brains hurt other people. Hurt brains hurt on the inside, and hurt brains need to be healed and repaired and recovered. And as soon as we start putting our energy towards healing and repairing and recovering these hurt brains, societally, in the big picture, all of us are going to be safer, healthier, and happier. And if we can remember that, and again, like just to reinforce, as we've all said the whole time, this doesn't excuse anything. Having a hurt brain doesn't excuse you from hurting someone else, but it does give us more clear understanding of the kinds of education and intervention we need to do. And so I just think it's a great phrase to remember as a public health agency, like how are we solving this big problem that's very, very serious?
Well, thank you for that, Jen. And then do you have any socials or anything that you want to push out to our audience?
Well, I, of course, want everybody listening today to read The Bullied Brain. It's available everywhere, but if you get it on Amazon and you feel inspired, because I'm trying to get the science out there and it's hard work, if you're inspired, please write me a review, just to say that, yeah, the science is important and people need to read this. That's my way of trying to get, really positive social change. And and then you can just find me. I write for Psychology Today regularly. My series is called, not surprisingly, Bullied Brain. And I do lots of speaking engagements and education and workshop. And I have a contact form on my website, which is bulliedbrain.com. And I love to talk to people and love to jump in and support groups. So don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Awesome. And I'll make sure I link all of those things in our show notes for our listeners as well. So thank you again for joining us today, Jen. It is always a pleasure having you on. If there's ever anything else you want to come on and talk about, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to have you back. But again, thank you. And thank you all for listening today. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and LinkedIn at TouchySubsPod to keep up to date when we have new content and new episodes going out there. Please email us any questions, comments, or concerns to touchysubjectspodcast@gmail.com. And please rate and follow us on your favorite podcast listening app. It really does help the show out.
And in the meantime, don't be afraid to challenge, ask, and discuss when it comes to touchy subjects.